Beginning in 1883 until 1929, American businessman Andrew Carnegie, founder of Carnegie Steel, decided to invest his wealth back into the public. Thus, the Carnegie Library was born. Join me as I travel the world visiting, photographing, and experiencing all of the still-standing operational libraries and the towns they inhabit. It's clear, after months and months of research and travel, that my self-inflicted schedule for this series had been cruelly and methodically demolished by my own hand. A grim omen, terrible foreshadowing of things to come. At first, I wanted to discuss Michigan Carnegies and what an average city library had to undergo in order to meet population demands. But that required more research and private access to Detroit, Maine's second floor, which is more tightly guarded than Disney's Frozen Head. Then, I wanted to move to Northern Illinois, the Quad Cities Express. But that notion failed when I realized I needed more coverage of the first libraries I ever visited. Next, I tried focusing on the big architecture video, the information dump about James Bertram, City Beautiful, the Library Bureau, Patton and Miller. But that failed because large portions of the script needed to be rewritten for those who do not understand what any of this heavy architectural discourse means. So, I took a swing at something more local, the Chicagoland Carnegies. Only 3 serve out their function, and I figured this will be a fast and easy hill to die on. But the photo lab I sent my negatives to caught fire, and since I don't trust the donkeys in Kansas, I was, again, at another teeth-grinding impasse. So, until I find another photo lab, or drag myself kicking and screaming back to Michigan, I've decided to examine the lost Carnegie libraries in the Chicagoland area, a sort of brooding preamble to the Chicagoland video proper. There are 20 lost Carnegie libraries that have either been demolished or abandoned within the Chicagoland area, 15 in Illinois, and 5 in Indiana. Some of the information is extensive, and some of it, like the libraries, is lost. What is clear is how deep some towns and cities are willing to bury their own library history, unwilling to utter the word demolish when mentioning the fate of their own library. They cannot confront the twisted reality that their predecessors demolished these community beacons. And no matter how hard they try to bury the body, that ugly, emaciated reflection is always staring back, screaming, "Nevermore!" Aurora, the town over from where I grew up in, was awarded $50,000 in 1901 to build its library. And before the cornerstone was even laid, controversy was already smeared across the newsstands. Closely allied to the library, and where possible attached to it, there should be rooms for an art gallery and museum, and a hall for such lectures and instruction are to be provided in the Cooper Union. Carnegie. According to the present outlook, what kind of library building is Aurora planning to build? Simply a one-story building as a repository for books with just 2 reading rooms? Little better for that single purpose than our present library building. Very pretty and ornate, architecturally, but absolutely a failure as a library building for the future is the proposed edifice. On the best authority, the Beacon has been assured that a commodious 2-story building of plain but pleasing and substantial design and of sufficient capacity can be built for $50,000, furnishing such additional rooms as are suggested by Mr. Carnegie. Ornamental buildings cost considerable more than the plain substantial ones, and it is asserted that a 2nd story can be built for about the same cost as the elaborate portions shown in the 1-story plan now under consideration. Provide the additional rooms as suggested by Mr. Carnegie, the furnishing can be left for the future. It will be the height of folly to build only for the present. The people wanted a 2-story structure, but the brass was too unwilling to give it to them. A two-story structure would cost somewhere in the neighborhood of $57,000, but E.D. Briggs, one of those building specialists, argued that the two-story building could be done for $45,000 if the pressed brick and terracotta were substituted for Bedford stone. Those numbers did not include the stacks themselves or the fees. For some unexplained reason, the two-story plan was passed over without adequate debate or discussion, and the elevation originally designed for the one-story building was adopted, after being changed internally so as to provide for additional rooms on the second floor to be lighted by skylights. The estimates shown that the building without the addition would cost more than what was available. Why a two-story plan, which could be erected for less than $50,000, should have been passed over, while a one-story plan with a second-story amendments is difficult to understand. In the end, the two-story building would prevail. It would open on August 22, 1904. The furniture was still in transit when people were allowed in. 20,000 books were moved from the old library to the new one. 3,000 of those were fiction. The interior was an absolute marvel. The whole place felt like a living room that you could just curl into and feel safe. Then, in 1969, it was so monstrously altered it was virtually unrecognizable from what it originally looked like. The original now is immortalized only in postcards. Blue Island was granted $15,000 in 1902, and the library opened the following year in 1903. The original Italian Renaissance-style building was modest in layout. The facade, however, was molded of Bedford stone, and inside the floors were gorgeous tiled mosaics, beautiful marbled accents, and beaming oak-paneled walls. It was all demolished in 1970. Brookfield received a $10,000 grant in 1912 and opened in 1914. The inside looked stunning, like all Carnegie libraries. In 1958, the library added an annex, and in 1985, the board thought it best to demolish the old Carnegie. A parking lot now rests on the original site. Chicago Heights received its grant of $15,000 in 1902. The new library opened the following year on September 11th, 1903. When the doors opened, the library only had 1,643 volumes and 2 employees. That's it. In 1972, the library was condemned, and in 1974, the original building was ultimately demolished. I still dream about this library, wrote Chicago Heights resident Kate McKillop on Facebook. In the children's section, I was there so much. They let me help with reshelving and bulletin boards and things. In the adult section, they tolerated me sitting in the stacks and reading until my parents picked me up. I had permission to take out anything I wished. Well, so much for that now. In 1906, Des Plaines received its $5,000 grant from Carnegie, and the new library opened in 1907. The original structure was angular, but symmetrical, with a band of rusticated limestone that wrapped around it like a necklace. The main floor, like all Carnegies, was raised to metaphorically signify that residents had elevated themselves by entering. Then, in 1936, the library was demolished. City Hall now occupies the original site. After months and months of relentless petition, organizing, and political wizardry, the Ladies' Library Association of Downers Grove finally secured an $8,500 grant from Carnegie. The new library, totaling $11,250 after all the fees and services, opened in 1915. Here, the association women stand on the steps of their building, for which they fought tooth and nail for. In 1956, the whole structure was inexplicably entombed by a wraparound addition. After a 1975 referendum, the building, disfigured and unrecognizable, was razed. In 1903, Carnegie granted the city of Evanston $50,000 to build a new library. It opened in 1907. Inside, it must have looked like any other stripped Edwardian interior. Beautiful. Spartan in the eyes of its community. But in a soundproof room on the mezzanine floor stood a pianola with rolls and rolls of musical score, donated as a gift upon its opening. In April 1960, the original Greek Revival Library was demolished. Geneva was awarded a $7,500 grant in 1907. Throughout its life, the library was heavily renovated and altered, but the distilled original structure, pictured here, opened in 1908. Inside, a stunning display of oaken furniture, columns, electric lamps, and a piano. The most extensive addition came in 1998, when a whole new structure was grafted onto the back of the building. This new wing of administrative offices is perhaps the most noticeable, hanging off the original like a mutated arm. This was the original floor plan. The main entrance was here. The addition, all of this, clamped down on the original like a steel vice. In 2020, the library moved out and surrendered the building to the city, where, as of today, it still stands, idle, empty, and collecting dust. Glen Ellyn was given a $10,000 grant in 1912. The new library opened in 1914, and until 1995, when the building was retired, it endured several extensive alterations. Today, it is a school district building, almost unrecognizable from what it was. At first, Highland Park was issued a $10,000 grant from Carnegie in 1903, and then a supplementary $2,000 shortly after. Altogether, $12,000. That original building was then demolished in 1929 due to population and inventory growth. By 1914, the original library was already too small to support the community, which had doubled faster than bacteria. In 1910, Highland Park had a population of only 4,209 residents. The library had only 6,658 books in its catalog. In 1927, the population spiked to 10,000 people and 17,000 books. So, it was demolished and replaced in 1931 by the current Gothic building, made of Indiana and Wisconsin limestone. The only information I could find of the original Carnegie building came from the microfilm archives of the Highland Park newsletter. It was a beautiful morning, they reported, on November 18, 1903, when the cornerstone was laid. When it opened in 1906, patrons described the interior as elegant, ornamented with linden glass, shades from Marshall Fields, electric lamps, and furnished with globe cabinets and tables. the lavish product of an aggressive campaign waged by the Women's Club, who only wished their community was more literate. Nabonidus, the last king of Babylon, who dug down 27 feet for the old cornerstone of a temple he was rebuilding, and found it was laid 3,200 years before, said our descendants would dig for the foundation of this Carnegie building, remove the cornerstone, open the copper casket, and read its contents in the year 5105 AD. So it was declared as a time capsule lowered into the earth on November 18th, 1905. The Patton and Miller Design Library only lasted 23 years after that, before it was destroyed. The story and fate of the Highland Park Library was all too familiar to the residents of Grange. Carnegie issued a $12,500 grant in 1903, and the new library opened in 1905. It was a modest but impressive structure, quaint and sleepy. It didn't call attention to itself. However, due to population spikes and an increased volume of books, the old Carnegie was grinded down to the bone and demolished in 1968 in favor of a more accommodating structure. Morris was issued a grant of $12,500 in 1912, and the library opened in 1913. The original Prairie-style building operated until 1969, when it was demolished and replaced by the current structure. I found no photos of what the original building looked like, let alone history. It was clear I had to drive down to Morris myself to fish for information, so I hopped into my car and bolted down the highway to the Grundy County Historical Museum. Right before the turn, I slammed on my brakes and came to a screeching, grinding halt that nearly threw my spine out of alignment. Of course! It's Good Friday, and there just had to be a parade of doe-eyed parishioners marching across the intersection so that their children could haul a 10-foot cross to some distant macabre ceremony on the other side of town. But I digress. The photos I received, the history I was told, courtesy of the Grundy County Historical Museum, is indispensable. If it wasn't for their careful work digging in the storied mines of history, Morris's Carnegie would have been lost to time. Their collection is an undefeatable testament to their efforts and to the real, tangible legacy of the Morris Carnegie Library. I myself would be lost in the time fog if it wasn't for their lantern. The original library opened in 1913 after a relentless petition by Edith Smith, pictured here in 1963 during the library's 50th anniversary. The circulation desk, shown here in the 1960s, was handcrafted by Oman Fosen, an area cabinet maker. It still exists, now a gleaming heirloom, still serving its function in the new library for a whole new generation of bibliophiles, book addicts, and dark academia junkies. Many of the original furnishings are kept locked away at the museum, but they offer a narrow glimpse of what the interior must have looked and felt like. The hat rack, the newspaper holder, the card catalogs, shown here in 1969 now, one of which includes a secret trapdoor lockbox for money. The 1948 dedication plaque to the Bowker family, which rested on shelves donated by Dr. Frank Bowker, library board president and co-founder of the original Carnegie Library from 1912 to 1953. The newel post, pictured here in 1969, a year before demolition. It still survives, rescued from the rubble and later gifted to the museum. Even this, a faux stack of books that contains the original library's collection of stereoscopic cards. The original library endured its fair share of renovations, but its purest, most sublime form can be seen here in this 1913 postcard. And again in this 1913 photo by George Bedford. Back then it boasted a set of enormous oak doors and transom windows, and a relief in which the words, "A gift of Andrew Carnegie," was engraved. In 1962, the whole entrance was remodeled to include a railing and to replace the oak doors with cheap aluminum doors. But more importantly, the board seized the opportunity to engrave an addendum beneath the original inscription, Morris Library. Now, the board felt, the library had finally belonged to the city. The last renovation came in 1968, 1 year before demolition, when the basement was converted into a children's room. In fact, the children of First United Methodist Church were there in 1969 when the wrecking crew descended on the old library and tore it down. The tragedy was immortalized in a collection of crayon drawings, which was then presented to librarian Miss Gordon Gregg. "We went down to see the library," the children wrote. "Some men were tearing it down. We heard bang, bang, bang. We heard bricks falling. We heard glass breaking. It was very dusty. Someday, we will watch men build the new library." Once the dust had settled, the old Carnegie was gone. In Park Ridge, Miss Boning, secretary of the library board, wrote to Andrew Carnegie, "When I tell you that we have 447 pupils enrolled in our school here, and many more who attend the high school in Des Plaines and the private schools, you can readily see what a library could mean to us." Carnegie issued a $5,000 grant in 1909 to build a new library, and later increased that amount to $7,500. The new Arts and Crafts building, designed by architectural heavyweights Pond and Pond, opened in 1913. After their work on Hull House, Pond and Pond were celebrities, utterly invaluable in reshaping the architectural landscape of post-fire Chicago. Next to Patton and Miller, they were heavy experts. The first librarian, Ruth Coleman, worked in a modest setting. Modest, if not anemic, at least to us. The original library was beautifully furnished with radiant woodwork. In 1957, a new building was ordered to meet the demand of a growing city. The following year, 1958, the new library opened across the street. The old Carnegie still stands, undefeatable and too ordinary for its own good. I stood there for some time, empty and in the cold, staring off into the closed doors. I saw a hair salon sign and an Allstate insurance sign. At least it's here, I figured. At least it's here. Ray Bradbury, a native to Waukegan, described his library as one of his favorite haunts. Carnegie granted the city of Waukegan $27,500 in 1903. The building, designed in Ionian Greek revival by self-insistent library specialists Patton and Miller, opened later that year, and lasted until 1965, when the library left for greener pastures. The old Carnegie still exists, thankfully. Now, sealed in a cocoon of metal scaffolding and chain-linked fences, suffering through the painful stages of metamorphosis, only to emerge in the next stage of its illustrious life, the Waukegan Historical Museum. Better that than the Wrecking Ball. Wilmette was also an elusive library to source images of. In 1903, Carnegie granted the city $11,000 for a new library, and it opened 2 years later in 1905 with a catalog of 1,347 volumes. If it weren't for the archivist, Eva Ann Johnson, who wrote a short history of the library and who provided me with these incredible photos, I would have been right up Schitt's Creek. When it opened, the library was an immediate success. In its first year, it accrued 500 registered users and circulated around 9,000 volumes. The photos help illustrate how vital these librarians were, and still are, to the communities they lived in, especially for the children. Ironic, considering the mindset back then ran under the philosophy that children should be seen, not heard. Or, in some cases, neither. Indeed. There is some snark humor in seeing these libraries become something of a supplementary school for children, when, in the time they were built, children were not permitted in most libraries. The librarians believed the space should be shared, that knowledge and the pursuit of knowledge should not be restricted to anyone. Libraries should be the focal point. They are the beating hearts, pumping people and knowledge in and out, oxygenating the brain. Without them, a community could die. Half of Indiana's Chicagoland Carnegies still exist in one form or the other. They were mainly built in immigrant communities, where education among the mill and factory workers was dire. Out of the 11 Indiana libraries within the Chicagoland area, 5 are either demolished or abandoned. East Chicago was the first city in northwest Indiana to receive a grant. Carnegie endowed $40,000 to be split across 2 branches in 1903. The first library, on Bering Avenue, now called the Pastrick Branch, was dedicated in 1913. It remains a library. Indiana Harbor, which received $20,000 of that lump sum, was also built in 1903. The new Arts and Crafts building opened in 1913 and endured 70 years of service until 1983, when it was abandoned. Consumed by overgrowth, woodwork callously plundered, rotting in the sun, forsaken by the very same community it helped nurture. Then, in 2005, a $4 million renovation was approved by the city as a last-ditch Hail Mary effort to breathe new life into the building. The project was a desperately needed shock to the vitals. Everything had to be rebuilt from the ground up. Lighting, doors, stairs, heating, AC, electricity, new paint, new tiles for the roof, new deck for the roof, fireplace cleaning, floor restoration, new copper gutters, window replacements, foundational shoring, all of it. It was a collaborative miracle between the East Chicago Department of Redevelopment and the Carnegie Performing Arts Association. The library reopened in 2015, 2 years after it celebrated its 100th anniversary, as the East Chicago Visual and Performing Arts Academy, and as the headquarters of the Leon Kendrick Youth Voices United nonprofit. For 20 years, the old Carnegie laid in ruin until it was returned to the community it fostered. It once again serves the families of East Chicago, providing sanctuary for young artists, musicians, dancers, and singers alike. The sacred fire of Vestra, restored by the city, tended by the community. Let us hope it will never burn out again. Hammond received its $27,000 grant in 1904, with a new furnished library opening in the following year, 1905. It served a largely German immigrant population that worked in nearby steel mills, meatpacking plants, and trolley factories. I could find no other information about the library, other than it was raised in 1968. In Gary, the first library opened in a rented storeroom on September 1st, 1908. It only had 936 volumes and 75 magazines in its collection. In the spring of 1910, Carnegie granted the city $50,000 to build a new library, later increasing the amount to $65,000. The new Central Library, framed in classical revival, was, to say the very least, arresting. It recalled the libraries in Detroit, Chicago, and Galesburg, molded out of Bedford stone, huge engaged columns bolstering up that striking entablature. My God! Bertram probably shit blood when the plans ran across his desk. Inside, it must have felt like stepping into the library of St. Gall's Abbey. Beautiful oaken shelves and tables and cabinets. Beams of light pouring in through the tall paned windows to set the polished wood aglow. A temple of knowledge, to be sure. Then, on its 50th anniversary in 1962, it was demolished. And that was that, as they say. Actually, the city of Gary would be the recipient of 3 separate Carnegie grants: the main library, the Hobart branch, and the Bailey branch. As time ceaselessly marched on, it became more and more clear to the library board that branch locations were an inevitability to counterweight the growing population and inventory. The Hobart branch, which was part of an extended township service, received a grant of $16,000 in 1914, and still stands today. But the Bailey branch, named after Library Commissioner Louis J. Bailey, is where things take a sudden, drastic nosedive straight down into the earth. A goddamn Greek tragedy if I ever heard one. The neighborhoods in which the Bailey branch would service were described as the melting pot district. Immigrant families, mainly Czechs, Poles, Slovaks, Serbs, Hungarians, and Greeks, comprised of mill and factory workers for the meatpacking lines, the railroads, smelters, and refineries. By 1910, 49% of Gary's 7,000 residents were from across the pond, and that number was then sharply augmented by the Great Migration, which saw 6 million African Americans abandoning the Jim Crow South for greener northern pastures. It was such that a publication claimed Gary hosted 29 racial groups. The library, then based out of a small, nondescript room in the Frobel School, was fighting an uphill battle against this surge. Children needed education, and their parents, who couldn't speak English, required help learning the language. In 1910, Carnegie granted the city $25,000 for a new building. Library trustees would supplement another $8,200 for the construction and property rights. The new branch, styled in colonial revival, was designed by A. Frank Wicks, using a simple gabled roof, brick walls, and 2 very subtle Corinthian pilasters. This sort of scaled-down revival approach felt more domestic, according to the board. The revival style was often used in churches and post offices. Then, in 1918, the new branch opened, Louis Bailey becoming its first librarian. We will never know how imperative and consequential that library was for those immigrant communities. The Bailey branch would be in use until 1963, and it was abandoned in 1977. It was registered as an historic place in 2004, but that didn't stave off the overgrowth, or the delinquent marauders from trashing and harvesting the interior. As of 2018, it looks like just another boarded-up brick building, now forgotten, condemned to rot in its own waste. Valparaiso was endowed with $20,000 in 1906 to construct a better and more centralized library than its predecessor, but construction wouldn't begin until 1911. The new structure would be designed by heavyweight architect Edward Tilton, who conjured the immigration station at Ellis Island and who had already cut his teeth in the Carnegie Library business. It opened on May 26, 1916. When the Depression hit, Valparaiso National Bank sunk like a stone in shallow water and took the library's $4,000 retention along with it. But the library endured. The Work Progress Administration scrambled to employ as many people as it could to restabilize the country, and so a fleet of newly minted workers marched to the library to help with preservation, repairs, and cataloging. When the Depression ended, many had the library to thank for helping them along. As a gift of appreciation, the workers donated 350 Victrola records. An extension was grafted on in 1980. Then the crossroads appeared out of the haze. Continue with the old library, adding more and more extensions, or build a new one. The brass voted to demolish the old Carnegie in 1994 in favor of a new building. But I'm told the decision was hard to reconcile with. Maybe that's true. Pieces of the original were picked from the rubble piles and spared the wrecking ball. They are now on display in the new library like some perverse skeleton museum. I don't blame the staff today for what happened, but it takes a lot of gall and heavy negation to never once use the word demolish to describe what happened to the old Carnegie Library. And why would they? Indeed, it relocated. What happened to the library, like Harvey, Chicago Heights, and Wilmette, is an embarrassing stain, a bleeding testament to the importance of the National Registry of Historic Places. Never again. Join me next time as I continue to postpone my trips to Michigan, Northern Illinois, and Chicagoland. Instead, we're headed for the hills in West Virginia, snaking along the Ohio River and checking out all the Carnegies along the way. Will there be coal up in them thar hills? Will we see genuine Mothmen? And what is the deal with all the poverty? Find out next time on Carnegie's Wild Ride.